Hello, everyone. This is John McDonald. I am back here for the next episode of our June Jubilee of Marvel's leading men. We're talking about the leading men of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So, this isn't going to include people like Charlie Cox as Daredevil, but it will include some surprises. Um, I guess if we end up wanting to talk about Charlie Cox, we can. I'm not going to stop us, obviously. But there are so many films to talk about with so many potential leading men that you kind of
Yeah.
have to make a choice,
Mm.
which is one of the things we're probably going to touch on today. I'm here again with my fabulous, lovely co host, Magnus, who has made everyone's dreams come true with a special celebration thing that you sent out to all of us that wished you a happy birthday. So, happy birthday again.
Just my little gift to everyone from the birthday boy.
I appreciate that. Yeah. So we're gonna get started here again today. So a couple things that I kind of want to bring up before we get started.
Mm. Yep.
Um, there's kind of a fine line in Marvel movies that we're gonna start seeing, where they're gonna start becoming formulaic, where they're still very grand, but they're not very camp. They start to feel more like DC properties. The X Men
Mm.
universe is kind of the X-Men universe is kind of on its own, as it is normally in the Marvel universe. So we're going to talk about the X-Men in a different episode. But when you think about Marvel movies from the 2012 point on, it starts to feel formulaic. It starts to feel safe. When Aaron Taylor Johnson comes back as Quicksilver after being in 2010's Kick-Ass, which is also a Marvel property, it
Mm.
has a really different feel. It doesn't take as much risks. It's not as camp. It doesn't really push in that direction. It's very real. Even with CGI, there's this real concerted effort for realism, for Oscar nominations, and while that's good, there are some drawbacks to that. And
Mm.
so when we're thinking about Marvel films and leading men and leading villains that are male, we start to see more Shakespeare and less, Arnold Schwarzenegger as Mr. Freeze. And it's not necessarily good or bad. It's really about what you want out of your superhero experience.
Mm.
I will say the one person that gets shafted, no matter how you look at this, is Andrew Garfield as the Amazing Spider-Man, which is where I think we should start because that's where we ended.
Yeah.
And I
Mm.
think this poor part of the franchise, I think if Andrew Garfield hadn't been open about Peter Parker potentially being bisexual, he probably would have got more screen time or they would have shifted some things around. So I think it was partially that Marvel wasn't comfortable with queer superheroes, really.
Yes.
Because really, the only queer superheroes we're going to find that are open are going to be in the Deadpool movies coming up. But there are no real queer Marvel leading men outside of fan art, really. Like I said, North Star isn't really a part of the X Men universe.
Mm.
They're not playing up Wolverine being bisexual at all. It's all in subtext.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, and Bobby's not even out in the comics at this point. So really, I feel like the reason the Amazing Spider-Man films aren't as well remembered is because they kind of shoved them so they'd be forgotten, both of them.
Mm.
And then Andrew Garfield's like, yeah, Peter Parker could be bisexual, and the Marvel executives were like, no.
I feel it's a few different things. For one thing, as at this point, the MCU's really kicked off. Um,
Yeah.
I think by this point when we get the Avengers have been come and gone, it was absolutely massive beyond words. I think Disney and Marvel were suspected. Did Disney own Marvel at this point? I forget.
Disney's first Marvel film is The Avengers in
Right.
2012. So this is the point where they now officially own it. They haven't bought
Ah,
Lucasfilm, so they don't
okay.
own Star Wars, all of Star Wars yet, but they're getting there.
Right.
So they've just started their conglomerization.
Okay. So in my head, a few different points come up.
Yeah.
So that's so you might see the tunnel shift because of Disney's involvement and Disney realizing that they're seeing all of the um attention towards the Avengers. I think the Avengers were always known about, certainly within comic book circles and a little bit within popular culture, from the different cartoons that we'd had over the years, but as the popular superhero team, I think that solidified it in many people's minds.
Yeah, they
And
were not popular before these films. Even in Marvel
Mhm.
canon, Iron Man, even in like Final Crisis on Infinite Earths, where they did the big crossover where Robin and Jubilee hooked up,
Yeah.
um, everyone but really Thor was kind of a joke. Thor was kind of off on his own. I feel like
Mm,
before these set of films, like people did not take the Avengers seriously in
no.
Marvel lore that I can think of at least.
But then suddenly you get these portrayals which people jump onto, like Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man, Chris Hemsworth as Thor. They become, in a way, so linked to the portrayals of these characters that that decades after this, they're going to be seen as pretty much like how Henry Cavill is with Superman, pretty much an archetype now
Yeah.
of the character. Um, so I think Disney and Marvel took notice, and this is probably why we start to see the tonal shift into more because they focus on becoming big, dominating blockbusters from
Yeah.
this point onwards. And we start to see them slowly developing it from like one Marvel movie into like two every year.
Yeah,
And
2013 is the last year where we have 3 or less Marvel movies. After
Mhm,
2013, we start getting 5, 6, 7 a year, including animated, not including stuff on streaming services.
mhm,
And so you start to see the exhaustion, but you start to see the formula. So when Loki comes back in a later Thor film, they've
mm,
kind of tamped down on how eccentric he is, but they've upped his like Shakespearean bad guy quotient, so he says a lot more, but he
mhm.
also starts to really vibe with his brother Thor, which you don't feel in, the first Thor movie. And you don't really feel that in the
No,
Avengers so much when he's the bad guy. And it's not a 180 because Loki's personality has always been like a million places all over the place, but it is influenced
yeah,
by fans, or at least what the Marvel executives think the fans want. And I'd
sure.
argue that version of Loki is the successful one, is the one that takes over Asgard.
Mm. I mean, it helped a lot that, as you say, fan favorite villain,
Yeah.
um, Tom. I'm gonna get his surname wrong.
Hiddleston.
Hiddleston? Hiddleston.
Hiddleston, yeah.
It helps that Tom Hiddleston is quite easy on the eye as well.
And
Um,
he's a really great actor too. It's not just that he
yep.
plays a really handsome Loki. It's that
Mm,
if you see Tom in other things like Night Manager and in my favorite Tom Hiddleston film, and not just because he's naked, I think it's called High Rise.
mm,
You really see that Tom Hiddleston comes from a theater tradition, and so even in a CGI green screen room, he has the ability to move his body and feel a presence that is
yeah.
hard to do with green screen, which is what Marvel movies are going to start to rely on more and more, and not really going to places of being on a set and being very alienated. This is where Marvel movies stop being fun and start to feel like jury duty service for actors that want a paycheck. And while there are some standouts, 2013's
I,
Iron Man 3 is far out competing both the Wolverine and Thor: The Dark World, which are the two other Marvel movies
mm.
that year. So
I mean, I'd argue that you are going to have different levels of quality in any massive franchise. Uh, I really enjoyed Captain America and the Winter Soldier. I thought that was a great chance for um, Chris Evans to really continue developing Cap Cap's character and how he feels within this new world he finds himself within, but then also to give him a chance for not one but two different potential shipping partners and such
yes,
between Sam and then oh, Bucky, that's it.
yeah.
How can I forget Bucky for a
Well,
second?
there was Bucky, there was Sam. People were shaping him with Tony, and
Yeah.
so the way that Steve's character kind of ends and goes back in time. We'll get to that, but yeah, they
Yeah.
definitely Marvel definitely tanked the arc they were building.
Mm.
Um, I really
Yeah.
like the Amazing Spider-Man films, and I'm really sad for it.
Mm,
I'm happy Andrew Garfield
yeah.
got to come back, but I'm really sad because both the Amazing Spider-Man has to follow the Avengers, and the Amazing Spider-Man 2 has to follow Captain America: The Winter Soldier, arguably
Hey.
the best loved classic of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, arguably. And so these this poor little part of the franchise that I want
Mm,
because I love Emma Stone as Gwen Stacy too.
mm,
I loved the idea that it's more of this like pseudo spy thriller, and they're doing like private investigator work. It's very like Harry Dresden, and I think Andrew Garfield as Peter Parker carries whimsy that even Marvel Comics doesn't seem to give
mm.
Peter, because they just want to like use him as the universal whipping boy. But Andrew Garfield always felt like he was fun. Tobey felt like he was taking a mantle. Tom Holland has kind of the vibe of being not the understudy, but being the one that's kind of learning. And Andrew Garfield is the one that there's sorrow, but there's also whimsy. These
Mm,
Spider-Man movies for me are the fun ones. If Tobey's laying the groundwork, this is
yeah.
adding decor into the house. And these are a little more pop. These are a little more colorful.
Mm.
The villains are really interesting. Um, I really do think that it's a shame that we didn't get more of the Amazing Spider-Man, because I
I,
think
mm.
that was very successful for free. And Andrew Garfield is not bad to look at either. I
No,
appreciate Andrew Garfield. So
I feel so I should make it clear that I'm agreeing with you that I really like Andrew
yeah,
as a Peter here. And I do think it's criminal that he didn't get more screen time. He seemed to have got quite a nice amount of new attention from um No Way Home. So it
yeah,
could well, with s- with Marvel seeming to now be trying to like recapture all the previous canon into variants and such,
yeah.
it could well be work as a backdoor to bring him for a third movie, but we'll have to see all the nonsense with Sony and all the complicated rights issues and such.
Yeah.
That's a whole other kettle of fish.
I would like to actually
But,
do an episode on No Way Home, because I
mm,
think both the way they tell the story and the nostalgia of it is one of the few times it's
mm.
successful. And so I definitely want to put a pin in No Way Home and come back to that at some point. Yeah,
It's certainly quite a little bit different to anything else that the MCU had done at that point. I won't let us get too distracted. We'll get back to the main juice of everything in a second. But
yes,
I agree with you. It's certainly very interesting because it's sort of like it's an entry in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but it's also an ode and a tribute to the earlier works and to Spider-Man as a whole. So it really stands as its own thing, actually.
I would argue too that this is one of the last actual comic book films the MCU does. Because as much as
Mm,
we love Age of Ultron, as much as we love Civil War, as much as even we love Guardians of the Galaxy, they have this sense of realism that I feel the Amazing
mm,
Spider-Man and the X-Men series, the X-Men Days of Future Past, the younger X-Men series, really understands it's a comic book property, so they add saturation and color. Um, for me, part of the Marvel formula that I start to see is the DCification of things that they did
mm,
with Batman Begins, where they start to make Gotham so realistic that
mm.
they're correcting too far. And as much as I love Captain America Civil War, and as much as I love like all the stunts, it starts to feel like a stage show where they're doing stunts more than a comic book film to me.
Mm.
And that's not bad. That there's definitely places for that. But like until we get back to like Thor Ragnarok, where we get that weird sexual tension between Chris Pratt and Chris Hemsworth. I think that's the one where they finally meet. There's just there's a sense to me that I start to see Marvel being afraid of having a comic book film.
Yeah.
And that doesn't work because now we're going to get where we get. So I really wanted to like the Wolverine in 2013 because I don't really have a connection with Iron Man. And I think the
Mm.
Wolverine's kind of Japanese samurai heritage saga stuff is really interesting, but it's so realistic and it's so
Mhm.
heavy. And like 5 other people saw the Wolverine, and none of us had a good time, and it makes me so sad. And 5 people saw Thor: The Dark World, and nobody had a good time. It makes me sad because I love Jane Foster. And so like we get to 2013, the last where we're gonna get the last of just having 3 in a year. And Iron Man 3, the one I don't connect with, is probably most successful, probably most well liked. I like Robert as Tony now, but like it was a big deal to cast him as Iron Man in that first Iron Man film.
Yeah.
And I don't think people think about he was not always Iron Man. He was not always in a good space for it. It was a big deal. And so
Mm.
by Iron Man 3, he is now Tony Stark, but he wasn't always. He's
No.
still not my favorite leading man, but that's a personal thing. And you're not wrong if you love him. He's just, he's fine. He's just not for me. It's fine.
Mm. Well, to make a quick point about that, the fact is that Marvel's done a good job of creating so many leading men that there's quite a lot of choice for you to find someone that you personally have a connection with. Um, some people say, "Oh, I really enjoyed Chris Evans as Cap. I enjoyed Tom Holland as Peter, Chris Hemsworth, etc." Or one of the multitude of it's still important, but dare I say secondary
Yeah.
leading male characters. Because let's be honest, um, the Falcon and War Machine, like for quite a long time, they were very much background, like supporting characters
Yeah.
to the main Avengers cast. Like eventually Falcon got elevated and such, and I think War Machine is this they've still got plans for him in some capacity. Um, but
Yeah.
they were a second fiddle. Um, I wanted to touch you said about the Wolverine. We
Yes.
touched on this last time. By this point with the Wolverine, if you look at the movie posters for it, you'll see Hugh Jackman completely ripped, claws out, with a
Ugh,
katana on the front covers.
poor
At
Hugh
this point,
Jackman.
they're
Oh man.
selling the sex appeal
Yeah.
for Wolverine. That is the testosterone draw to the male gaze there. Just
Poor
want to
Hugh
say.
Jackman. He just wanted to dance, man. Hugh Jackman just wanted to dance, and they made
Mm,
him deal with gain all these muscles. Here's an interesting thing about the Wolverine part of the X-Men franchise is that he's the only leading man. All the other top billed characters in that film are all
mm,
female. He is the testosterone of that film. And when we think about eccentric X-Men villains, you get like Juggernaut, you get like Sabretooth, who is his brother, who Liev Schreiber did a fabulous job as. You even get kind of gross out ones like Toad, who you don't expect, but like when people watch the movie, you think about it because it's visceral.
mm,
When I think about problems the MCU has and things that kind of the fandom never picked up on. What I always found out interesting about the secondary leading men of the MCU is unless they were as physically fit as
mm.
the core three or the core four, they were
Yeah.
never really sexualized, except for Hawkeye, who eventually became a really popular kind of secondary love interest. Like Happy Hogan. I've never seen art or fic where he's sexualized, but he's always turned into like a Papa Bear figure. It's a
Yeah.
very interesting thing where the secondary males, like Phil Coulson, there's some
Mm,
stuff where the guy who plays Phil Coulson is the lead and he's very hunky, and the MCU never plays it up. It's almost like they only want one leading man at a time. They can market, and then we get to like Thor and Star Lord together, but for some
yeah.
reason Star Lord and Drax they never try to make happen. Not just because Chris Pratt is by this point fully homophobic, but more to the point
Yeah.
because they never attempt to have two dueling same handsome level leading men. And I would argue John Favreau is attractive. And so to have neither the
Mm.
MCU nor the fan base ever give him the same chance of being sexualized is kind of I don't know. I don't know how I feel about it. As someone that's kind of big on body positivity, it almost feels like that same argument about, say, Power Girl in DC, where she has the boob window and like no rib cage. And when they introduced Spider Woman, how they introduced her costume so it was like beyond skin tight.
Mm,
It's something I thought about was not just the eccentricity of the villains and how much more they started looking human, but about how, especially the people that fall in love with the leads, never seem to fall in love with the secondary leads in the same way. Like, I can't think of anyone that lusted over Happy Hogan, and I hope I'm wrong because I think Jon Favreau deserves lust,
mm,
even though he's not like as built, and we never see him in a tank top like we see Tony. There's absolutely no reason why Happy Hogan, for instance, can't get that same level of love as
mm.
Tony does.
Yes. I mean, at this point, as we're going through the second phase and into the third phase, I think the whole thing of the, dare I say, incredibly handsome, heroic looking white dude,
Yeah,
it's becoming such an obvious trope in itself. And for a long time, like it was thought about as a bit of a problem, but that as time goes on, as the movies were getting more predominance, it was becoming a lot more clear, shall we say. Um, I'm
yeah.
glad you touched upon the elephant in the room because at some point I wanted to very briefly mention about Chris Pratt and
I mean, I
poor.
will I will fully mention because I'm angry and bitter about it.
Mm,
But yeah, so Guardians of the Galaxy is kind of the secondary big movie of 2014 because Days of Future
mm,
Past wasn't as well loved, and we're going to talk about X-Men in a different thing because they kind of deserve their own thing. But you
yeah,
had Captain America, Winter Soldier people, and then you had Guardians of the Galaxy. When we first see Chris Pratt as being all tanked out and goes from being the schlubby, lovable Andy Dwyer to the guy that finds Jesus, dumps his wife and his imperfect child, and then becomes a Marvel leading man. And you can tell by the tone of my voice that I have a lot of feelings about it. And this is also the same church that I think Justin Bieber goes to. And so I have a ton of feelings, but Chris Pratt, whether you like him or not, is a Marvel leading man. Yes, and I could
mm.
probably do a whole 40-minute stand-up routine on this, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to say that I'm still upset that he ended up taking away my Twilight Zone Tower of Terror in Disneyland, and that the Guardians of the Galaxy movies are fun, but I wish they'd cast somebody else as Star-Lord. So there you go.
I think that's a sensible position to take on it. I have been upset by, unfortunately, Chris's personal choices. And there is an argument to make that that shouldn't necessarily affect your opinion on the character. And when I'm watching the movies, like I can get into Star-Lord as a character, and I suppose I do see past the actor portraying him, and I enjoy Peter Quill as who he is.
Yeah,
Um, a chap that's usually out of his depth and sort of just slinging his way through with his guns and his Walkman and trying to make the best whilst being a normal person in a very and well,
yeah.
I say normal person. I know that he's the son of Ego, the living planet. That was a whole other trip. Having said that, yeah, I'm kind of glad that it looks as if Star-Lord might not be coming back for too much more now, or they might recast like a
Yeah.
new actor within the role.
Well, he
Uh,
famously wants to go live on a sheep farm, so I think he should, and leave the rest of us alone, and he can have as many homophobic thoughts and have as many perfect Schwarzenegger children as he wants to have. Just leave the rest of us alone, and yeah. Um,
in in terms of disappointment, that actually might lead to another good point I want to make, whilst I remember it. Um,
yeah,
how the Sam and Bucky relationship shipping was sort of derailed by one of the own actors. Now, this is skipping forward slightly. It's not touching on one of the movies, it's touching on one of the series. Um, The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. And do you recall what I'm speaking about here?
I don't, because so it's about at this point, we're not quite there yet, but
Hmm.
after Logan, I'm gonna say I got really burnt out on Marvel movies. And so
Okay.
I haven't really like I know there's streaming stuff, I've seen gifts, but I don't have the same relationship with Marvel
Hmm.
streaming as I have with Marvel films per
Okay.
se. Yeah.
Hmm. So just to give a brief overview of it, this is one of the times where Disney and Marvel's control of the narrative slightly failed. And what I mean by that is we touched upon previously that it's clear that Marvel and Disney are trying to keep a tight control over sort of like how the actors are acting in public and how they're portraying the characters to sort of like keep the MCU as really the golden meal ticket it is. And I can freely admit that I'm a big MCU fan, but I know it's the goose that laid the golden eggs for Disney. Like, it's giving them so much money and so much attention, and they want to keep it going as long as possible. That's why they've mapped out what 3, 4 new phases beyond this one of like what they want to say. And with the so what I mean by narrative failing, Anthony Mackie, who played Sam, aka the Falcon, aka New Captain America, he did a sort of buddy cop slash political series with Sebastian Stan as the Winter Soldier, and they went on this big adventure together and what have you. And there was a lot of there was new best friend platonic energy between them, but it also led to a lot of shipping
Yeah.
energy where they became an established couple in for many people's personal canons. In an interview after the series finished, about a month or so afterwards, Anthony Mackie went on record and said that he personally didn't like the fact that people were shipping Sam and Bucky together, that he saw them as just best friends. And he felt it was slightly ridiculous that people were seeing a romantic subtext there. Um, and that was a personal interview he did, and there was a bit of a backlash against that.
And
Um,
now, so here's one thing I'm gonna. No, finish your thought, and then I'll respond to the thought.
I think my to
Yeah,
conclude on that, just to keep it nice and succinct, to my mind, that was an example of what had been becoming a popular ship that was dead in the water because of the basically the actor having an issue with the fandom having a certain portrayal of their relationship. And I think that there was a few people in Marvel that might have asked him not to have said that just because they know fan shipping brings interest, shall we say,
yeah.
you know. And that's my fault.
I would give the counterpoint that I think people forget that fan fiction is and fan art is still kind of a niche thing. Um, and I will not blame Anthony Mackie for having that opinion. I don't actually know Anthony Mackie's sexuality. He could be straight, he could be bi, he could be pan. I don't know, but it's also kind of weird because I can't think of anyone that's ever asked Chris Evans about his thoughts about gay Steve Rogers or bi
Mm,
Steve Rogers. And so to ask the first arguably major actor of color, because Terrence Howard and Don Cheadle were like really not even part of the Iron Man press. Maybe Terrence Howard more because he played it longer, but to ask the first person of color in your franchise about how they feel about queer shipping, which is maybe not something they've experienced before, it may be not something they were prepared for, or it may be something the Marvel exec sent him out to take the flack for as their official position. Um, it's just like I don't think his opinion's bad. He wasn't actively telling people not to do it. It doesn't sound like it wasn't openly homophobic. It was like, I see the character this way.
Mm,
It's one of those things where, like, if Chris Evans had been asked that, I would be less bothered. If Chris Hemsworth had been asked about the idea of Asgardians being pansexual, which is pretty well Marvel canon for a long time, it's just one of those things where, like, people really need to have in mind that comic books were not mainstream really for a long time. I'd argue even the
mm,
Batman films that were very much DC's kind of staple film for a while, because even
mm,
Superman took breaks. Like, there's, I just, I'll have to gather my thoughts and see if I can think of an appropriate response, because I think people may have let that throw water on something. But I will state, because I want to kind of loop back to the main point, um,
mm,
I actually like some of the headcanons Guardians of the Galaxy created in fan art. So we went from Avenger Tower, where everybody lives in like a communal friends apartment.
mm.
The Guardian
Yeah.
of the Galaxy headcanon that Guardians of the Galaxy is just a space D&D game gone wrong is actually one of my favorite non-sexual headcanons, where this is the Avengers playing different versions of themselves in space, where they don't get the game or they're just doing it to annoy the GM. And so there's this great prevalence of fan art in 2014 that has this wonderful sexual energy, but also there's a great platonic fan
Mm,
art. There's this idea that people have come to think of these people as a family. And so when we get to Avengers Age of Ultron and that first real big split in 2015, it really is a big deal.
mm.
Before we get to
Yeah.
2014, can you tell me what Marvel animated film that came out in 2014 that is technically part of the 5 film block that came out in 2014, this first big block of Marvel movies?
Oi. I cannot off the top of my head. What is it?
2014 was the release date of Big Hero 6, which is the kind of first
Oh.
big feature animated Marvel film, because Big Hero 6 is technically a
Oh
Marvel
yeah.
property. And
Hmm.
so this is interesting too, because after Big Hero 6 came out,
Mm,
the big brother from Big Hero 6 and some of the male characters started getting sexy time treatment as well, which I am
mm.
kind of
Tadashi.
amused by as a thought. Yeah. Not just Tadashi, but all of them now kind of have fan art for themselves, which is
Yeah.
interesting. But yeah, so we're going to go
Mm,
from 2014 to 2015. 2015 is when we get the classically panned reboot of Fantastic Four with Miles Teller and I think Michael B. Jordan's
mm.
first turn in the MCU, because I think Michael B. Jordan was part of the
He
Fantastic Four remake.
he was. He portrayed Johnny.
Oh,
I
that's interesting. I would never have cast him as Johnny Storm. I can't even
that
envision that in my head. That just
the
sounds weird.
very quick thoughts about the reboot. Oh my God. The tone shifted constantly. At some points, it was a sci-fi film. Other points, it was an interpersonal drama. And then the last 20 minutes went into like deep, like sci-fi horror territory. Um, it was all over the place. And my partner could not get over Kate Mara's wig changes.
Yeah.
Like he kept grabbing my arm and saying, "Look, she's done it again, and they done it again, and they done it
That's a,
again."
that's a bad sign for a movie. Michael B. Jordan will return in Black Panther, of course. But
Mm,
yeah,
yes.
so I don't think anybody liked the 2015 Fantastic Four. Certainly, the chemistry for the male leads was not there in the way that we
No.
saw with Julie
Yeah,
McMahon, Ian Graffold, and Chris Evans. I do enjoy Michael Chiklis, so I'm not mad about that either.
Jamie Bell was Thing, wasn't he? If I remember correctly. Um,
Sure, yes,
yeah,
why not?
a- absolutely, absolutely awful. Literally used him for a few scenes. Then he transformed. He and Reed had no actual. There's no evidence really of their friendship.
That's a shame,
So
because
it
because because
was dead.
Ben and Mister Fantastic are big friends in the comic series. That's kind of the whole conceit, you know.
Yeah. I don't want to linger too much because I feel that we could probably do a mini short on the failed. We could probably do a mini short actually just on Fantastic Four
Yeah,
as a film franchise property, looking at the campy one from 2005 versus the grim dark version a decade later, and what they could possibly do when they bring the characters back in the
yeah.
future.
Uh,
Something to think about.
2014, 2015 is also because I do like some parts of Fantastic Four. People that like the Lego Marvel films and Lego Marvel video games. This is also when we start to see those rise in prominence.
Mm.
And so there's no sexy there because they're blocks. Um, but that is where you can get an idea of what friendships look like organically because the video games handle it really well. So let's talk about Ant-Man because I think this will be a shorter one to talk about.
Mm.
Ant-Man for me is really the first Marvel property where they cast a leading man not to be conventionally sexy. They cast Paul Rudd to be kind of really smart, to have chaotic energy, and to still be sexy, but to be more like not dad bod, but dad sexy. Almost
Mm.
like they were going with the age of their kind of consumer audience. I think Ant-Man is probably one of the funnier MCU entries, and really it's because I don't think they foresaw becoming a long-term property. They probably just thought they were doing a one-off. Because I don't know how else they talked Michael Douglas into this. Like I can't even imagine that conversation.
Mm.
Um, but I think Ant-Man is the first. Like, if we're going to talk about Tom Holland, if we end up talking about the Kingsman trilogy, which is also in 2015, which is also a Marvel property, though it's not very well known that it's a Marvel movie. Ant-Man is kind of the first dad energy cast leading man, which Paul Rudd has always had, but he's either your dad or like your fun uncle you see during the summer kind of thing. It did not
Yes.
keep people from sexualizing him by any means, which I am not
Well,
against, but like there's something very specific uh comedy dad energy about Paul Rudd that we didn't have in the MCU before.
mm. and Ye and yes, that's certainly been reflected in the multitude of fan art I've seen of him, which has a bit more of a playful bend because he is quirkier
Yeah.
than some of the other leading men that we've had. Completely agree with you with the dad energy-ness to him. I think it comes across because from the start, they make it clear that he's had this whole past to himself. He's he's been entangled with the law. He's got a teenage daughter. Um, he brings along this baggage, and it's really good for his character. But it does help come across that he's been through a lot, and that's his mode for redemption. In terms of the sexualization, there's that infamous shot of him out of the costume and um like tending to some bruises and such and showing off his incredibly ripped physique. Um which does slightly touch upon a comment we've made before about the fact that Marvel likes to take its leading men and really go full ham, making them, super sexualized sort of thing. And
My some of my favorite fan art comes out of Ant-Man. So there's some things I love about Ant-Man. So if we ever do like a deep dive into these movies, Ant-Man's on my list. The
okay.
Baskin Robbins scene, which is very iconic, people love.
Yep.
I think Ant-Man is also the beginning of the side character of Louise, who does the really great descriptive um, retelling of the Marvel universe. I think he's in the
Yes.
Ant-Man films. My favorite thing about the Ant-Man films, though, is the Randy Meeks artwork, which is very hot and definitely highlights his desires to please Captain America, which is all I'm going to say. But this is one of my favorite things is that when you think about the playfulness of the Marvel Universe, and I go back to my comment from the first episode of this
Mm.
about how in Mallrats, Stanley is like, why are you all focused on the genitalia of these male superheroes? This happens with Ant-Man. It doesn't really happen in the first Ant-Man because he doesn't become Giant Man until Civil War, but it does
Mm.
happen. And so I think Ant-Man is a nod back to that kind of Mallrats 2005 Fantastic Four playfulness about what's
Mm,
underneath the costume. Not in a way that feels like super invasive, but in a way that reminds me of the conversations that were had before Con was mainstream. Maybe some of the conversations that people were having when they were writing the first fan fictions, which were Kirk and Spock.
mm,
But Ant-Man feels like it's not a return to form. It feels like it's something for people that don't want to go into a Marvel movie having all the historical knowledge. It feels like a film you can watch without having to have watched 14 other
mm,
films, which is great because no one's got time to watch 14 movies to catch up on the backstory. That is
mm.
the major drawback of the MCU now is that you have to have watched 14 films. You can't watch a standalone film anymore. You have to have historical knowledge or you need to know about weird exclusive characters like Beta Ray Bill because they're show up in the end credits. Also, I don't want to have to stay for end credits. I'm just gonna say it. Mid end credit scenes are dumb. End credit scenes are done. Just stop
Yeah.
making the movie when you're done with the damn movie.
But mm.
I was holding that in for a long time. Let me tell you what.
It's quite all right. This is a safe forum for you to unburden yourself, dear sir.
Well,
Uh,
except everyone on the internet now knows that I don't stay for the end credits of Marvel movies, so I'll probably be. I bet they have an end credit scene in Barbie, and I'm going to be booed as I leave the theater in my Magic Earring Ken cosplay because I didn't stay for like the very last second when they show like the super secret Skipper joins the Avengers end cut scene or whatever.
mm. Um, sorry, I can't help laugh at that.
No, it's fun.
It's a um
Yeah.
one little. I have one more point about Ant-Man. Did you have anything else you want to say about it before?
Paul Rudd was very sexy in P.S. I love you, man. Paul Rudd has always been sexy. Paul Rudd will
Hmm.
always be sexy. Paul Rudd is eternal, ageless, and probably an immortal vampire. Paul Rudd, call me. Yes. What were your final thoughts on Ant Man?
I was just going to comment that you were saying about Stanley and the comment about focus on genitalia and
Yeah.
such, and that you do actually see that such was the popularity of Ant-Man, that it did leak through into um, another series. I'll just quickly touch upon this. Amazon's The Boys.
Yes, I have heard of it, and I have seen some stills on some episodes, and I've enjoyed Jensen Ackles' prolific ass. Yes. So, yes.
um, People will probably know what I'm talking about here in reference to. There is a scene, I believe it's the third season. Um, I think it's the first episode. There's basically a hero, or well, I forget what they call their heroes in this universe. Do you remember what they call them?
I believe I know what you're talking about. It's the opener of
It,
the season, and I believe it is the Might or someone like that. They
yes.
didn't reach very
Yep.
far from the source material for that.
No. Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Um, a hero with size-changing powers, and he decides to give a partner a very interesting experience. So yeah, I think that was
Yeah.
lampooning a popular trope from Ant-Man.
And if
But
we ever do talk about the boys, the way that they do the boys is actually not as debaucherous as the comic. Um,
mm,
and it's something that we see across these kind of revamps of these series is that they're not nearly as like Watchmen. Watchmen isn't nearly as debaucherous or as brutal as the Watchmen film was. Um, Also, I guess we can move into Avengers Age of Ultron because that was really the big 2015 Marvel film. This is when and I did not realize Aaron Taylor Johnson had been in Kick-Ass because the glow up was like so big. And I think
mm,
Ultron is the first Quicksilver Scarlet Witch movie who underutilized in the MCU, sadly not in MCU X-Men at all, even though that's technically where they belong. I mean, they are there as Evan Peters, but it's not quite the same. Uh, Age of Ultron, Paul Bettany can't phone it in anymore. He actually has to come into the office. Vision weirdly doesn't get sexualized. Can't quite figure that out why. Avengers Age of Ultron is really where you start to see the cracks in the CGI and the cracks in the Marvel decision to not give their actors full scripts anymore. Famously, Chris Hemsworth and Paul Rudd talk about this in a Graham Norton interview, where they don't actually know what's going on in Marvel movies because they don't get full scripts anymore. And I think
Mm.
Age of Ultron is where I can start to see that, especially. I don't think it's bad. I think Scarlet Witch, especially if Scarlet Witch is, I can't even remember which Scarlet Witch movie is which. But if this is the one where Scarlet Witch is in it, I can really start to see the cracks. Age of
Yeah,
Ultron,
he is.
the sexualization of this kind of grown up Quicksilver and the relationship Aaron Taylor Johnson, Chris Evans had, especially that gif from them at Comic-Con where like Chris Evans is like touching Aaron Taylor Johnson. I see more of that than I saw of anything else surrounding Age of Ultron. Like I could not even like I know the plot surrounds Ultron because it's in the name, but the only thing I can tell you is that during the press tour for Age of Ultron, Chris Evans touched Aaron Taylor Johnson, and people like gift it into madness.
Yeah. Although, yes, they did that as the real life thing. Um, I would argue that you got a piece of solid fan shipping from this movie, though, in terms of from Quicksilver, but more his relationship with Hawkeye. Now, I know it was being meant to be portrayed as Hawkeye being a sort of surrogate father figure to both Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver, like trying to help them, like
Which is
figure out.
weird because Magneto is right there and he is their real father. Like, if they wanted to bring someone into the universe from X-Men, why not? Why? I
You,
it just causes so many
oh,
more questions than answers. It really does.
well, if I remember, just briefly, if I remember correctly, it's all to do with the rights issues again. Now, Sony and Marvel came to deal, if I remember correctly, where they was saying that we would like to use Quicksilver in one of our movies, and um, or we would like to use Scarlet Witch. And what was agreed upon that the Marvel MCU would be allowed to use Scarlet Witch going forward as a main character. So they could bring in a powerful female Avenger to try and um, balance the gender disbalance a bit more. And in exchange, Quicksilver became a predominant member of Fox's um, uh, X-Men series going forward because of Evan Peters and such. I mean, he became a leading X-Men and such. That's why in the movies you get a glimpse of Scarlet Witch as a little sister to Quicksilver in the X-Men series, whereas in the MCU, that's why Quicksilver got killed off in Age of Ultron. He
Well,
only had one appearance.
in I think for me, it's because Hawkeye famously in the comics is not really a put together character. He's very good at aiming, but everything else in his life as a trade off is a disaster. Quite famously, he is the character outside of Deadpool's that carries the most band aids in his kit. And so having Hawkeye making the choice to deviate from canon and do something so explicit in a Marvel movie is an interesting choice. I don't mind the shipping. It just goes to show you how much I don't remember this movie and how much
Mm,
like I want my movies to be consequential. And when I tell you I remember the press conferences for Age of Ultron more than the movie itself, that does say something. And
mm,
whether it's a good or bad movie, if at this point it's not memorable, then that's
yeah.
a lot of money spent for something to not be memorable.
Mm. It was mishandled, sadly. I've gone back and seen it a few times now, and in brief, it feels as if at some points they're trying to set up this epic scope as Ultron as more of a threat personally than Loki was.
Yeah.
to the Avengers, even though Loki had the freaking great big army he was getting. Um, they're trying to big him up, but for something called the Age of Ultron, the fact that Ultron never basically took over the world's computing systems and turned humanity's own creations fully against them, it it lacks a great deal of something. It could have been more finely tuned, but they only allowed Ultron to have one movie
Yeah.
to make a presence. And I mean that touches upon like one of the MCU's big flaws is the fact it struggles to know how to handle its villains.
Yeah. Oh, so here's the thing too, is that that's basically
Yeah.
the plot of Deceased, is someone corrupting is Darkseid corrupting Cyborg so he can take over the world, and Cyborg succeeds unwittingly because he's the Pandora's box. Um, I think for me too, I know we're talking about Marvel men, but of the movies themselves, Avengers: Age of Ultron fails but succeeds because of medium here, where in a comic book you are a little farther away from the action or closer depending upon how you read it. We're going to talk about Deadpool soon, and Deadpool has basically always been the fourth wall breaking character like the Joker is.
Yeah.
But Age of Ultron would work better as a comic book because it's a series, and a comic book character, you know they're going to come back. Death isn't permanent. It's a 2D thing in a book. No matter how much you love them, comic book characters are characters. And it's
Mm,
very hard to deny that. Age of Ultron expects realism, it's part of this big overarching thing, but you can't do that in film because the nature of Marvel Comics is the same nature of DC, where it's going to get reset, which is going to be a big battle. People are going to die. New people are going to take up mantles. If Marvel's trying to set up a new MGM, then you can't kill off Steve Rogers as Chris Evans, because even if you bring in a new actor, they can't be Steve Rogers. So you either have to create a new Captain America whole cloth, or you have to have a new version of Captain America from canon, and it creates a discrepancy in the relationship the audience will have, especially ones that aren't comic book fans, so they don't understand why you're killing off a favorite character.
mhm.
And it's a medium thing, and I know it's not quite. It's kind of dovetailing with the idea of Marvel trying to create a new golden age, Metro Golden Mayer Hollywood system, where they have all the stars and heavens. But here is Age of Ultron that shows why and how it fails so spectacularly with Avengers: Age of Ultron. Um, anyway, I wanted that was my thought. I hope I didn't interrupt something you were thinking.
Oh, oh no, I think we seem to be in quite agreement about the fact that unfortunately, if Avengers represented a high point for the franchise so far, along with a few other products, I feel that Age of Ultron sadly represented one of its low points at
Yeah,
the um but I mean after that, Marvel did try to kick itself back into gear. And it did start to
yeah.
produce some very interesting stuff after that.
So,
Um
because of time, why don't we do
mm,
this? We are going to talk
yeah,
about the X-Men at another point. So let's talk about
yeah,
Deadpool at the other point in time with X-Men. Because I know that we want to get to Spider-Man Homecoming, so we can talk about Tom Holland a little bit.
yes,
So let's do Captain America Civil War, because I think Civil War is a very important, very good moment in time. I don't have
yes,
anything to say about Doctor Strange, or we could talk about Guardians Volume 2, but Guardians Volume 2, let's not talk about Logan because that's an X-Men. So really we have Civil War, Doctor Strange, and then Spider-Man Homecoming.
yeah.
So I don't have anything about Doctor Strange much. So do you have anything about Doctor Strange you want to talk about?
Not particularly. I can see why they brought Benedict Cumberbatch into the franchise. At this point, he was quite popular still from his portrayal of Sherlock in
Yeah,
well the self-named series Sherlock with the BBC. So he did portray a good version of Doctor Strange, and they were. But at this point, we are starting to see a bit of fatigue around origin movies.
yeah,
Um, I think they were able to get away with it a little bit by the fact that they were starting to focus more on the magic side of the universe, and they, yes, the CGI it's a bit hit and miss sometimes in here, but I did like the kaleidoscope effect that they were trying to go for. It had a very nice trippy aspect to it. Mm, But that's mostly my thoughts about Benedict. I think he played the part
Yeah.
well.
I think for
Um,
me, Doctor Strange is an interesting thing because if you have characters that are sexualized for being rebels and characters sexualized for being like responsible father figures, Benedict as Doctor Strange is the hybrid of those two things for
mm,
me in fan art and fan fiction. That's really the only thing I can say about Doctor Strange. Also, I think Tilda Swinton
the
um
ancient
plays
one.
his plays his mentor, yeah, the ancient one, which is weird and kind of fun. But I think really in 2016, if you weren't enamored with Deadpool, or maybe you were enamored with Deadpool, you were enamored with Captain America Civil War. This was the
Yeah,
big Marvel property of 2016. um I think Civil War, not just as an entrance for Tom Holland, because this is really the first time we see him taking up the Spider-Man mantle. This is also really about Falcon taking his place. This is
yeah.
about Bucky and Steve. This is about the breakup of Steve and Tony. This is kind of the precursor to Ragnarok, where Thor and Hulk are going to have time together. Civil War does a lot.
You,
There's a lot going on in this film.
you make it sound like one big gay drama.
I mean, it
What like
is, because like
two?
having Steve sitting at a table, like flipping through this like big law thing and being like, no, no, what is this about the secret prison under the ocean you're building? It's, you can't get much gayer than Captain America Civil War. Like, there is no
Mm,
gayer Marvel movie than this, if you want my opinion.
mm. It's basically a group of friends. They have a big falling out, and then they go for a cat fight outside in the street, which pretty are. And they bring along their new little twink as well, who gets involved fighting. And then you have the massive breakup and the bitch fight and all of
I
this,
do like
basically.
Civil War too, because Civil War also brings us kind of that, we go from clean shaven Steve Rogers, who is a bit of a rebel, to full on anti hero nomad Steve Rogers. And this is where Chris Evans excels. This is where we'll start to see him branch out into things like the Knives Out films, where he plays a full on villain. Um, Civil War works because Chris Evans as Nomad Steve Rogers doing the right thing works. Like the
Mm,
breakup with him and Tony, because Tony just won't see why things are wrong, works really well. Um the pining of Steve and Bucky isn't resolved, but it's taken to a really heightened place. Um
mm,
and honestly, Steve's team of kind of rebels and vagabonds and people out of time, the fact that
yeah,
it doesn't include Thor, but it would have, because there's no way Thor would have sided with
the
Tony,
authority. Mm,
is, it's such an interesting, like, even if you just look at how the two teams are divided on the runway at the airport,
mm.
I think that's where the battle takes place.
It
There's this
is.
interesting thing with who is on what side and who Steve is defending, and the side Tony is on. And it's almost pitch perfect, different location, but so reminiscent of what Civil War was and what it meant when it first was a comic. And so even outside of the leading men of the MCU, even if for all the noise, Captain America Civil War is really where it was
Yeah.
all headed, and it felt like an occasion. It kind of felt like the last real Marvel occasion movie.
Mm.
Um, and Steve Rogers was super sexy as Daddy Rogers, being sad and disappointed in everybody. I mean, you can't beat that with a stick. I know that the popular theory is that Chris Evans was dropped because Buzz Lightyear failed, and they blamed him for that. But
Uh,
but I don't know how many people actually believe that theory. And
no.
also, Marvel needs Chris Evans more than Chris Evans needs Marvel. Let's be honest.
I
Yeah.
no, I don't agree with that theory at all because of the fact that Chris Evans is so well known, so popular, that he's such an attraction. He is literally such a leading. I say leading man. We said that a lot here, but I don't mean that in any sort of negative or detrimental way towards Chris, because I think he has the charisma and the talent to really bring something to any role that he's in. I mean, his performance in Knives Out, which you mentioned previously, it was so great and such a different way of seeing him. It was just fantastic. I do feel that, from what I understand, his contract was ended with the last Infinity War movie, and he probably had had enough of playing his character, which by this point I think he had been doing it for about a decade, and
It's a
anyone's
long
going to give it to
time for
him.
anyone playing one character. Ask the cast of Are
Yeah,
You Being Served? It's a long time to play
yeah,
any one character.
and he wanted to do other things, and I completely respect that. So I think, yeah, Lightyear's whole thing was a different kettle of fish.
Yeah.
Um,
Uh, I would like
sorry,
to.
go on.
So that's an interesting thing you bring up. That is the other side of the kind of Marvel trying to bring back the Pantheon of Stars MGM thing is that they do actually like fumble into people that have this energy, like Chris Evans, where there's effortless charisma to them,
Mm,
where the catalyst is Captain America, and I still have trouble seeing as him as a brunette. It's weird to me that he's not a blonde in like real life.
mm,
But it's one of those things where like both he and his brother Scott have this incredible playful charisma that really is old Hollywood.
mm,
And I think Robert Downey Jr. doesn't carry that as much because he has the eccentricities from the 80s still a little bit. Chris Hemsworth is kind of like your favorite foreign born actor, even though he's white, his like language and the way that he lives his life feels kind of tropical and different from an American born actor.
yeah,
There's something very hometown about Chris Evans as Steve Rogers, as Chris Evans that works so
yeah.
incredibly well. He's kind of like that frat boy that you can love and you can be safe with. I think someone described it once, and that does kind of work
Mm.
in a good way.
It comes back to what you said before. He's very soft masculinity.
Yeah,
And that's a perfect way to describe him. He has power, he has strength, like, but at the same time, he has like also compassion
yeah,
and empathy. And well, his whole thing about compassion and empathy is exactly what put him in the spot where he had to make all those decisions in Civil War.
yeah.
Um,
It's a new version of Steve Rogers because for so many years Steve Rogers was
mm,
like a Boy Scout and then he was a caricature, which is why he became Nomad, which is why then they ruined him by making him Captain Hydra in that pocket universe Franklin Richards created, which is a whole thing that we don't have time to get into because it's a whole
yeah,
mashugana. But there's something about the leading man of this version of the Avengers that we're not even in Infinity War, they're so different from what they were in Civil War that
yeah,
you never really see them again the way that you see them in Civil War. And
no,
specifically, just because at this point, too, Chris Evans is going to go off. And I think 2016 is when he started to do things like Snowpiercer, where he's getting away from Steve and he's going to start
yeah,
doing smaller things like the movie he did with the little girl that was like really smart. So like he's still
yeah,
playing that role, but he wants more. And I think
mm,
people responded to the idea of an actor that had all this fame, but wanted more of something interesting. And it
mm,
worked in the case of Chris Evans. It works for Robert Downey Jr. as the character that has kind of that Phoenix arc in real life where he was at the lowest of the low and then he came back. It
yes,
gives you both the nostalgia and the redemption. Um, and then Aaron Taylor Johnson goes and does an amazing film like Bullet Train, So it's really working. And Mark Ruffalo, of course, is always amazing. And people are
mm,
just finding out about his film he did with Gwyneth Paltrow, where he
mm,
played an airline pilot. That was great. So yeah,
yeah. Mm, yes. So I completely agree with you. So Captain America: Civil War, um, it came out a year after Age of Ultron. Um, I don't think they were intending it to be so, but to my mind, Civil War almost feels like it's more the worthy successor to the original Avengers. Because at this point, these people as a team have history, they've got interpersonal relationships, but sadly, and this is partly due to the outside interference from Baron Zemo and such, but you could start realistically, you're starting to see that they all have different opinions
Yeah.
on what this newly developing and emerging heroic superhero scene should look like. And it makes sense. And after this, sort of like the status quo gets broken
Yeah.
within the MCU. Tony starts founding his own team of Avengers, which leads into other stuff. And you actually see like the main leading men, like Iron Man, like Cap, they're starting to take a back seat as this new wave of new heroes or secondary characters start to take more of a step forward, as it were.
And
Um,
Civil War is also, too, I think Civil War, this is also where we see more of Natasha's backstory. We see some of it in Age of
yeah.
Ultron, I feel like.
Mm,
But also, this is where we start to see they're not just doing a Scarlet Witch as a one off. It feels like they try to give us more of Natasha. It's going to lead into um, the film with her and her family. So it's really neat to be able to give Black Widow the due she deserves because she's a
oh,
big deal in the Marvel
yeah.
comics.
Yes. Oh, and really, before, if nothing else, the one last point I should really make, if I make no other point on this episode, this is the film, not only Spider-Man and Black Widow getting some screen time. Think about it, this is also where we met, I'm gonna get his name wrong, Chakal,
Black
Black
Panther,
Panther.
yeah.
Yeah,
I'm just gonna call him Black Panther because I'm gonna butcher the name, so I'm just gonna call him Black Panther.
this is the moment where you can tell that Marvel afterwards started to try and make some efforts
Yeah,
towards diversity. Uh,
yeah,
didn't always work, but they
didn't always
tried.
work.
Yeah.
All right. So there's two things to do here as we're getting close to the end of the episode. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 is well loved for being like a father to son figure picture film. We haven't really touched on Yandu because I really didn't want to talk about Chris Pratt for an extended period of time.
Mm,
But Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 is a really great film, not for the family, but about family, if that makes sense.
yeah.
They do rely a little too heavily on phallic humor, but that's also the franchise. So if we ever talk about the Guardians of the Galaxy as its own thing, minus my Chris Pratt hatred, we can do that at some point. But I want to give you kind of the last 7 or so minutes to talk about Tom Holland, because we're going to go from Captain America Civil War, and then we're going to get Spider-Man Homecoming the next year, which is his ascension, and which is the first hybrid film from Marvel with Columbia Pictures. So Spider-Man
Mm,
Homecoming is kind of the first Sony collaboration with Marvel, because I don't think Columbia Pictures was actually a 20th Century Fox offshoot. So Spider-Man: Homecoming is actually like a two studio production, as far as I can tell.
mm.
So the floor is yours. You got 6 minutes to talk about the Spider Twink, because I've set you up for that, and we'll do more about Spider Twink next episode. But you can start on Spider Twink and give us like a preview of what's wonderfully is it going to be a trilogy about the men of Marvel, the Marvel MCU. Really, it's
Y-
very fitting.
Yes. Well, I suppose you could see it like a free act play almost. The establishment, the drama, and then the new young prince that walks onto stage and claims his throne, etc. Something like that. Um,
Now, anyone that
okay.
knows you two knows that you love Tom Holland as Peter Parker too. Like that's kind of, for me, that's one of your trademarks. Is that I feel
Mm.
like that's your favorite version of Peter Parker. Is Tom Holland? I mean, I could be wrong, but that feels accurate to me.
I like all of the live action Peters for very different reasons. Um, I feel Toby's portrayal was wonderfully nerdy. and I enjoyed the transformation. Whereas I don't think there was such a stark transformation for either Andrew or Tom. Now, Andrew, I just enjoy his quirk. Uh, and with Tom, I feel that Tom quickly became the persona of basically Marvel's twink in residence, shall we say. Now, it is problematic, I will admit, because of the fact that technically this version of Peter is a high school student. And there I completely understand where people are coming from with that. And um I accept it that as the character that is something to be acknowledged, etc. However, it's really difficult not to see Tom Holland playing Peter and not see Tom Holland. And Tom Holland is very easy on the eye. When they looked for someone to portray Peter Parker, they did exceptionally well finding Tom Holland as him because he brought something new to the MCU that hadn't really been in there before, and that was a good deal of sort of like new hero, new youthful exuberance for the role. Now, Cap was great in the sense of Chris Evans' portrayal of Cap was great, but even when he was like skinny, Chris Rogers, he didn't come across as like young and exuberable. Um,
That's
and
because he
especially
was
when he
dying
did,
of consumption the entire time. Before they fixed him with
mm,
drugs, he was just like on death's door like 90% of the film. So
yeah, um, yeah, he basically became mega jacked very quickly, and it was the same with all the rest of them. Um, so I was quite drawn to Tom's portrayal of Peter as this very exuberant, very youthful thing, and he brought a good deal of comedy to the role. Uh, um, there's a nice bit of quirk in there as well, but I don't know. I think Tom does comedy well, but he's always been slightly more. He, I think if he had the choice, he wouldn't mind doing more serious roles. You've seen it with a bunch of recent stuff he's done that he's been stretching his acting talents in that direction. Or trying to do more serious things. But
yeah.
anyway, um, basically everyone else was hunky, jockey to various degrees, and then all of a sudden you have Twink. And this is why you see so many pairings of Peter with all of the older men within the MCU.
Sometimes
Because,
more than one at a time.
yeah, exactly. People just love seeing a daddy boy relationship. And if in
I
canon, yeah,
by the way,
so
I do need to say that it
yeah,
is consensual and he's always done of age.
yeah,
Because when I've done
yes,
theater stuff where stuff like that is even alluded to, like I've had straights that
yeah,
like just got up in arms and outrage. So it's never it's I've never seen it be non-consensual and I've never seen him be anything other than even a young 18 being 18. So
oh yeah,
everyone that does it has drawn that line. So that line does exist for the people listening going like, really? But yeah, so it's a thing that
oh
is
no,
it's a queer culture thing that I want us to be able to parse out the next episode because something about Tom Holland's Peter Parker that intrigues me is he's really the first heir to the throne in
yeah,
Marvel. And so the idea of having a mentor is just not something we've ever seen Peter Parker have. He always had Uncle Ben, but Uncle Ben is a ghost. He's a forest ghost, essentially.
he's a
Um,
reason. He's not a
yeah, it's one of
yeah,
those things where like Tony Stark and then the Jake Gyllenhaal Mysterio. It's really a new take on Spider-Man that doesn't exist in any other MCU
yes,
universe, and that is very interesting.
yes, no, definitely, and I completely agree with you, um, with what you were saying about the potential side of things and stuff like that. Um, I should have made that clear.
Yeah,
Because all the portrayals and all the art I've ever seen, people have been very clear to make it that he's college age basically, and that is really the age that people should be having him for if they're doing any work with him and stuff
Yeah.
like that. Um, and yeah, so that is what we were seeing. And the thing is, Marvel feeds into this. I mean, I cannot believe that they didn't look at Tom Holland and his portrayal of Spider-Man and then look at all of the older men that they were putting with him as mentors and like, as guides and stuff like that. And there wasn't some cynical thoughts there, shall we say.
Yeah.
They know the power of fan shipping.
And I think this is a great start to a conversation that is kind of long overdue. I think for a long time, superhero-dom, especially in kind of the big two comics, because there's not really a big third rail comic anymore. There's lots of indie now, which is great. But Marvel and DC kind of have been the go-to for a while. Sometimes Image is around, sometimes other things. Mostly it's been Marvel DC. And to have such mind-bogglingly straight spaces be something where queerness can inhabit as subtext. Now it's more overt, which is really nice, but for a long time it was just subtext. You can still kind of see that in fandom, even in younger fans, because there's such a rich history in both Marvel and DC, but especially Marvel, of having these, groups of heroes together with these dynamics that are very interpersonal and definitely can read both romantic, both as friendship and what have you. And I think Tom Holland as Spider-Man is going to be a really good way to kick off the end of the trilogy for the next episode. And it's an important conversation to have. Like the fact is that if you cast Tom Holland as, say, North Star, who is an openly gay X-Man, would the vibe still be there? You know. And so we're going to talk more about Tom Holland as Spider-Man. We're going to keep going through. The third part of the trilogy should get us all the way to hopefully Venom and beyond, because I kind of want to talk about Venom as a case study, going the opposite direction, where they tried to make Eddie Brock as messy and least sexy as possible, and it definitely backfired in a big way because it's Tom Hardy. I am very biased, of course, but that is what it is. Anyways, thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time for the next part of the June Jubilee, Magnus's birthday, where we're talking about the Men of Marvel, and then after that, probably we'll be premiering something just for the summer. We're experimenting with a bit of a shorter format for August, leading up into our busy gay Christmas / Halloween season, because that's what Halloween is, gay Christmas. And so we're going to see if we can do shorter episodes about things that we really love, but we maybe can't do like an hour and a half on. But we definitely have enough going for Marvel. I'm not quite having Once Upon a Time flashbacks yet, but there's a lot. Even just talking about the leading men, not talking completely about the films themselves. There's a lot to uncover there about our queerness, about how we reflect the time of our superhero, and about how things change as things become popular and you have to start doing a formula. You don't feel like you can take as many risks. And with Marvel having bought out, especially in the movie universe, so many other smaller properties, or bigger properties too, like Star Wars, it's an interesting thing to watch happen, and to see how the audience really participates in that, both in the movies and in fandom and in heteronormativity versus queerness, and the backlash and the front lash and all the lashes. But it's a great conversation. I'm glad to have it with you, and I'm glad for the audience listening in. And we'll see you next time on Everything is Gay, Even the Straight Stuff. Have a good night.